But let's just play out the hypothetical, because this is what Elon was threatening with one of his tweets was, I'm going to retire Dragon. Okay, if that were to actually happen, what that means is that the U.S. has been cut off from its national lab in space, the ISS, and has no way of accessing that lab to get people in and out of it.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. This week has been another jam-packed 7 days. We've been served up mounting heaps of coverage of protests, mostly in Los Angeles, and Israel has launched what may be a protracted military campaign to destroy Iran's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capabilities. Many Middle East experts say that we're witnessing the beginning of a new era in the Middle East, and Israeli planes and drones have struck more than just facilities. It's believed that Israeli forces have killed the commander-in-chief and deputy commander-in-chief of Iran's military, and the heads of the Quds forces, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that Corps' airspace unit leader. But here at home, we have some unanswered questions regarding the recent Trump-Musk conflagration. U.S. President Donald Trump and SpaceX CEO Elon Musk were once very close buddies, but they broke up the bromance in a fairly public fashion 7 days ago. And in the heat of flaming each other on social media, the guy who sits in the Oval Office, that's Trump, he threatened to kill SpaceX's government contracts. The guy who runs the space transportation company that shuttles NASA astronauts to and from the International Space Station, that's Musk, he threatened to decommission that space transportation system, the Crew Dragon space capsule. Reports are that on Monday, the two spoke by phone. And like many of you, on Wednesday, I too saw Musk's conciliatory post on X. This has all the right plot lines for a bro rom-com. But if you care about the Golden Dome, if you care about getting to the moon or establishing a space economy, if the business case is built upon government contracts and inexpensive launch, a rapid, unscheduled disassembly of this frenemy ship could very well leave the United States exposed in the space domain. Just how exposed? That's the question I put to this week's guest, Todd Harrison. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And he's also the Space and Federal Budget Yoda, who all of us look to help demystify budget proposals and legislation. Here's our conversation. Hey, Todd, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Hey, great to be here.
So with President Donald Trump and Elon Musk, we've got this pretty serious breakup between what seemed like a mutually beneficial friendship. The protests against ICE operations have taken over the news cycle, but for us folks, right, that are involved with space and national defense, let's consider the potentialities of just what a RUD between the two billionaires could actually mean. I realize that just this morning, Musk is saying he's regretting some of his social media posts. So there's hope that they'll patch it up, but hope is not a strategy. So this is a bit concerning. It shows us some vulnerabilities, some exposure, no?
It does. And, we should have seen this coming because the political alignment of these two people was not that great to begin with. And it looked like from the beginning that there were going to be some substantial disagreements. And now those have come out. But I agree. It's been really disappointing and a little, unsettling as the two have had this public feud erupt in the last couple of weeks.
And the effect on the possibilities for national defense and also for NASA. It could be some big stuff. So let's start with civil space or NASA. What's the actual state of play, right? NASA depends on SpaceX launch and transportation services, and SpaceX is heavily involved in taking American astronauts to the lunar surface when we actually go back to the moon, which we're, supposed to go there as in return boots to the surface in about a year and a half, sometime before the end of 2027, which by my personal opinion seems a bit ambitious. But for this conversation, how heavily does NASA rely on SpaceX?
They are critically dependent on SpaceX. The main critical dependence right now, the immediate dependence, is to get astronauts to and from the station. SpaceX is the only American system that can do that with their Dragon capsule. The intent of a commercial crew was to have two providers, but with all of the issues that happened last year with Boeing's Starliner, that system is not operating right now. So it is only SpaceX that can actually do this. And so if SpaceX were to say like, hey, we're not going to bid on any more Dragon crewed contracts anymore, NASA would be stuck. I mean, the only other option to dock with the space station for crew is Soyuz. And for a variety of reasons, I don't think that the United States is going to go back to paying Russia for seats on their Soyuz.
And there's another thing there that also sort of struck me, right? So let's just say the United States government canceled a contract with SpaceX, or SpaceX decided to, cancel its contract with the US government. At the end of the day, it would produce all kinds of bad, because part of SpaceX and part of going to the International Space Station, leaving aside the issues with the Soyuz rocket, which does have issues, right? I mean, there have been pretty weird leaks and stuff like that. But I also wonder, I mean, what would it actually say about the United States if we couldn't send our own astronauts to the ISS and back from the ISS? I mean, that has knock-on effects, does it not?
It does. And I mean, the immediate knock-on effect is it would fracture the ISS consortium of nations. Because the US, which is the predominant partner in the ISS, would not be able to fulfill its duties. It would not be able to maintain the station. I mean, I don't think this is going to happen at all. Let's be clear.
Right. These
Because
are
both,
hypotheticals, but we got to
yeah,
understand what our
right,
exposure is, and to just
yeah,
understand the gravity of what this could be.
yeah,
To
and both sides are cooling off and backing down. But let's just play out the hypothetical, because this is what Elon was threatening with one of his tweets was, I'm going to retire Dragon. Okay, if that were to actually happen, what that means is that the US has been cut off from its national lab in space, the ISS, and has no way of accessing that lab to get people in and out of it. That would really mean the end of the ISS. We would have to start decommissioning it, or we would have to start buying transportation again from the Russians, which again, I don't think that's going to happen given, the relationship between our two countries. So he is literally in the position where he could cut off the ISS in that program early. And when he was tweeting that, he knew good and well that's what he's threatening. That's what he is pointing out. The power that he has and how he is potentially willing to use it for political ends. And so I think that is what really got a lot of people upset for good reason.
So I also see the rides to the ISS as part of another problem, right? So if that were to actually cease, there are other contracts specifically going to the moon, right? SpaceX has a huge piece of the Artemis program. That piece is a human landing system, or HLS. It's already kind of in a weird spot because of the proposed cancellation of the Lunar Gateway. So that has to be all rethought out. But so what happens if the gateway is canceled? What happens if the HLS contract were to be canceled? It's a hefty contract worth more than $4 billion. And, I'm going to kind of circle back to the ISS in a second, because I also see this having other kinds of knock-on effects to what the U.S. has as its goals in the cislunar region. But yeah, what would happen to the Artemis program?
So, on Artemis, there's less of a dependence on SpaceX. You're right. They are the planned lunar lander for the Artemis 3 mission, but they are pretty far behind in development. I mean, if you take the program schedule at face value, they would need that lander operational, fully operational for the first human landing 2 years from now.
Yep.
They can't even get a Starship into orbit,
Yep.
much less the landing version of it, much less all of the refueling flights that go into just having that one lander ready to go in lunar orbit. So they are far, far behind where they should be. Now, I say that because NASA has a backup. They have a second lunar lander that's being led by Blue Origin and a consortium of other companies as well. So, were the SpaceX Starship lunar lander, if that was taken out of the equation for whatever reason, the program's going to be delayed. It was already going to be delayed. And there is another lander already in development that could be slotted in for the first landing. So I think there's just much less of a dependence on SpaceX for the Artemis program.
Well, that's really good to hear because I was actually kind of worried about how the effect of this Trump-Musk RUD would actually affect the Artemis Accords, right? Because we have quite a few nations now that are part of the Artemis Accords, and yet if, rides to space or rides to the moon seem to be difficult to come by, that could have a real dent on the
Well, and
success of the Artemis
I,
Accords and actually
I
prop
think
up the Chinese.
I think the Artemis Accords are still at risk, regardless of what
Oh, really?
happens with
Okay. Well,
Trump and Musk.
tell
I
us
do.
about that.
Well, because I think all of the cuts that we saw coming in the NASA budget request.
And the Lunar
I
Gateway,
think
which we didn't build, that was an ESA
yeah,
thing, right? So they built it, they
I
delivered it. So what's up with that?
I think that that stuff is still going to be cut. I don't think that was driven by Musk. I think Musk was fine with it because that helps accelerate things to Mars from his perspective. Well, guess what? I think Mars is dead. I don't think this administration has any intention of funding, missions to Mars, even though the president said it in his inaugural address. I think Mars was being pushed by Elon, and I don't think there's anyone else that was pushing it. I think that the budget director, Russ Vought, I think he is pushing cuts in NASA, and I think that is what is going to drive cuts in the Lunar Gateway and ending that. And if you kill the Lunar Gateway, that was a lot of the participation of our allies and partners in the Artemis Accords. That it was based on being part of something, and what they were part of, many of them, was the Lunar Gateway.
And that was also their
So
ticket to send their astronauts to the lunar surface as well. That's how they were paying for
yeah,
it, essentially.
so what NASA would need to do to keep the Artemis Accords alive and keep that consortium of nations together is they would have to offer something else for these folks to participate in. And it could be a good situation if they turn this around and go to the all the allies and partners, especially the European nations, and say, hey, help us build a permanent presence on the lunar surface. That could be great if we could get them to step up to that. I think the problem is they had already invested in Lunar Gateway, and so the money's gone.
And they delivered it. I mean, the actual thing is here in the United States, I believe.
Yeah. So we pulled the rug out from under them. Why are they going to, believe these promises again? But then the second reason I'm not very optimistic about it is I don't think the Trump administration cares about building a consortium of nations to go back to the moon. I think they're perfectly happy, perfectly content to do it on their own, and this be a U.S. only mission. I am afraid that the Artemis Accords are in danger of basically dissipating because this administration has not made a priority of building, allies and partnerships in space.
Wow. All right. Well, speaking of partnerships in space, I mean, the International Space Station is a partnership in space, and that this is the last sort of big, huge chunk, I'd say, for the civil space part of our discussion, because SpaceX has a contract, though it has not been approved by Congress. So this is just a contract without money. Nevertheless, there is a contract worth $843 million to build a deorbit vehicle to deorbit the International Space Station. That does not include launch. with launch. And I would have to say everyone really should assume that SpaceX would be the thing that would be launching the SpaceX thing that would be deorbiting the International Space Station, because that just doesn't make any sense. But with launch, the price tag would be well north of $1 billion before inflation, and it could grow to be at least $1.2 billion from the last numbers that I saw. What is our exposure if we don't have that deorbit vehicle, if we don't go with SpaceX to deal with the International Space Station? And I do realize that there are people in the ISAM community that don't want it deorbited. We've covered this before. This is all hypothetical. So it not an opinion on whether it should or should not be deorbited. Nevertheless, yeah,
Yeah.
where does that leave us?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, it would be, go back to the drawing board. How are we going to deorbit this thing? Right. And I mean, whether you think it should be deorbited in 2028 or 2030 or some other date, it eventually has to be deorbited, and you need to do it safely. You do not want an uncontrolled reentry of something this large.
No,
That
because
that is not
it
a
will
good
not
idea.
all burn up before it hits the
Yeah.
surface, wherever that may be.
And it will cover a large area where it hits as well. So yeah, you got to do a controlled reentry. I would say that if SpaceX for whatever reason wasn't going to build this deorbit system, you would have to go back to square one, go out and get new proposals, rebid this, and pick a new company. And so it's probably going to cost a lot more if it was a different company, and because SpaceX has economies of scale and they can do these things on the cheap relative to others. And it would probably take a bit longer if you now had to recompete this and bring in a new company to do it.
They'd have to start
Technically,
like yesterday.
yeah. I mean, and technically, like, this is not, it's not rocket science, right? But yet it is. But it's a deorbit. You just need a lot of thrust. You need control. You need good modeling of the dynamics of the station as you're, moving it, but it can be done. And so, yeah, there are plenty of other companies that could step up and do this. It'll just cost more and it'll take longer.
All right. So now let's get to the thing that we love, which is, talking about national security, defense, space. What's the actual state of play in terms of just what DoD contracts there are currently with SpaceX? What missions do they actually support now?
I mean, the biggest dependency for national security space on SpaceX is with launch. And, the National Security Space Launch Program, SpaceX is, one of the primes that won that. They're not the only one, because it has been national policy and Space Force policy to maintain two independent sets of launch vehicles for all of their reference orbits. And so we have that. The problem is capacity, right? You've got, the other prime in the NSSL contract is ULA, United Launch Alliance. They're in the process of transitioning from their old launch vehicles, Atlas and Delta, to the new Vulcan rocket. They had 2 test flights of the Vulcan rocket.
Right. And Firefly's was the one that got certified to be like a priority provider too, I believe, right?
Yeah,
Or
they're
was it
really in
Blue
a different
Origin?
competition. Well, Blue Origin is coming along as well, but right now your two main for medium heavy lift launch, it's ULA and SpaceX.
The two
So
proven
ULA,
ones.
yes, and ULA, it's been slow. It's been a slow go getting the Vulcan certified. It's been,
Years behind
gosh,
schedule.
way behind.
Years.
So the problem right now is ULA has not been able to fulfill its launch commitments because of delays in Vulcan. Many of those missions have been moved to SpaceX, and SpaceX with their Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, they got no problem. They have a huge amount of capacity. They're launching at a rate of around 140 launches per year. And ULA is launching, I think last year, I think they had 4 flights overall, 2 Vulcan, and I think 2 Atlas. That's it. So, and this year, yeah, I don't think ULA has launched. Oh, they launched one. They launched a commercial mission on Atlas. So it's just orders of magnitude difference in launch capacity. And what that means is that SpaceX is the workhorse for DoD and national security launch overall. So if you were to take that away, ULA just cannot meet the demand. And so you would have satellites just stacking up, waiting to launch. It would be huge backlogs if you didn't have SpaceX fulfilling those launches. So now there are other companies coming along. There's Firefly, but I mean, in the heavy lift launch market, there's Blue Origin.
And Rocket Lab, I think, wants in too.
Rocket Lab's trying to get in, and so Firefly, Rocket Lab, they're at the lower end of this market. Blue Origin is at the upper end of this market. They're coming along. Blue Origin had a great, first flight of its New Glenn, reached orbit, didn't recover the booster, but, mission success. So
it didn't blow up over the Indian Ocean, in other words.
It did
Sorry,
not.
couldn't help myself. That was a reference to Starship, everybody. Sorry.
Well, yeah, no. So it is interesting that, with their new launch vehicles, SpaceX has kind of lost its mojo with Starship. They can't seem to get it into orbit anymore. But New Glenn makes it to orbit on the first try. So I think you've got a real competitor coming up in Blue Origin. But again, the question is, how quickly can they scale? They had their first test launch, what was it, January, I believe? Where's the second launch? Come on. They kept saying late spring. Well,
we're at summer now.
In spring? Is this late spring or early summer? I don't know.
I think once they open up the pools, then it's summer. Yeah, officially.
So that, Blue Origin's got to scale. They've got to get up their launch rate. And so does ULA with the Vulcan, if they're going to be real competitors to SpaceX. So I think that is the biggest concern in terms of dependency on SpaceX in the national security space market. It is launch by far.
So let's just dive into that just a wee bit more. Let's just put a bow on that, right? Because we're talking about satellites stacking up, satellites ready to go. But when it actually, gets down to it in terms of actually securing U.S. interests, what does that actually mean, right? Like, does it mean we have less coverage? We have less sensors? Does it mean we have to rely on communication satellites that we really shouldn't? I mean, what does it shake out to be? Like, what's the danger in that? Yeah. Or is there? Maybe everything's built to function for 15 plus years. Maybe we're okay. But I'd like to just dig into that. What does that really mean in the grit of it?
Yeah, I think the biggest impact is that these new proliferated resilient constellations, they won't get off the ground without SpaceX launching them. So, what the Space Development Agency has been building, they've got these Tranche 1 satellites that have been delayed. How are they supposed to launch? On SpaceX, right?
And they're designed to track incoming missiles, right?
Missiles,
I mean, because that's what I'm saying. Like, if you're just coming into this conversation, what is that? What's that effect? Like, so if we don't have those satellites going up, that would essentially affect our ability to detect, to track, to maintain custody, and eventually, hopefully, shoot it down of a missile, which is flying at hypersonic speeds through very low Earth orbit, atmospheric type of area. That's a big concern.
It is. And more generally, it slows down our ability to field space systems that are protected and defensible against attack, right? That's what these proliferated constellations are doing.
So that reduces our ability to deter.
Right. And it increases our exposure that, we could be, it will make us more vulnerable. That our existing space systems can be attacked. And there are some satellites that we just launch on a routine basis, right? Like GPS replacement satellites. And if you can't launch those, then, well, the old GPS satellites, they're going to need to operate for longer. That's fine. Most of them, continue to operate well beyond their design life. But what if, right? What if some of them break earlier than expected and you did not launch the replacements according to your schedule? and now the constellation starts to have degraded performance. That affects everyone in our
And
civilian
that
life,
affects our
right?
economy.
It does. And so, you don't take chances with things like that, that we are critically dependent on, both militarily dependent, but economically dependent as well. And so it's just part of being good stewards of our space capabilities is you've got to keep the launch cadence going. When the new systems are ready to launch, we need to be able to launch them.
All right. So let's then talk about Golden Dome, right? Or what could be called the goose that should lay many golden eggs for space and defense companies. Everyone who has attempted to calculate the cost of the Golden Dome, yourself included, has done so with the assumption that SpaceX, either the Falcon 9 or the Starship, will be used to deploy the satellites necessary to make this initiative operational. What happens to the numbers without SpaceX? Who will be there to
Mhm.
pick up the slack? I mean, I just can't imagine that the price tag would remain the same, and it is also, already pretty darn big, right? I mean, it's you wrap your head around
Well,
what 170, 180 billion dollars, right?
well, I would just people should erase the Trump $175 billion figure from their heads because he gave no details about what a time period that was over, what was included, what was not included.
Thank you for
That is
saying
just a
that.
random number. And honestly, I'll tell you the cost of Golden Dome, you know what it'll cost? It'll cost whatever you want it to cost because there are an infinite number of ways you can build a homeland missile defense system, and they haven't selected an architecture yet. Or if they've selected it, they're not telling anyone. So yeah, you could build you could call something Golden Dome for 10 billion, right? You'd buy a few more Patriot batteries, a few more THAAD batteries, deploy them around a few high value areas in the United States and say, there's my Golden Dome. Does it cover much? Not at all. Is it in an impenetrable missile shield that protects the entire United States? Nope, but nothing will be. And
But
so
with
whatever you
Golden
want it to be.
Dome, the way that they're talking about, I mean, they're talking about space-based, satellites that garage and keep, space-based interceptor vehicles to, get after missiles that are being launched in the boost phase, which is when they're still trying to, reach altitude. They're looking at this in a space-based manner. I mean, I can't imagine that the price tag, without SpaceX would not like skyrocket to
Well,
and
absolutely.
pun intended.
But what they haven't said, they said they want to have some sort of space-based interceptors as part of Golden Dome. That's not all of Golden Dome. And the space-based interceptors would be designed to hit a missile in the boost phase. Got it. That's really hard. That means you need a very large constellation in order to just hit one or two missiles. What they haven't told us is, okay, we're going to size this for what? For what threat? How many ICBMs do we want to be able to hit at once? And that determines how much this system of space-based interceptors would have to scale. So again, if you want something that'll just hit, one or two missiles, fine. You're talking about, my estimate, assuming SpaceX launch costs, like with Starship, you can get that, in the neighborhood of 20 billion, right? The initial like 5-year acquisition cost, it'll cost you more to keep replenishing the constellation down the road and keep operating it. But there's your initial deployment cost. You want something that will intercept, say, 100 ICBMs? Okay, it's going to cost you a lot more,
All right,
right?
well, let's just
Uh,
stick with the easy numbers. I mean, without SpaceX being part of the easy number,
yeah.
which I believe for you was 2 or 3, at least in the paper that I read, and I did reread it this morning. Uh, Without SpaceX, I mean, how would that affect the numbers?
Yeah, so your launch costs are substantial, but not the largest component of the cost of fielding space-based interceptors. If you don't have SpaceX, well, the way I did my cost estimate is the lowest launch cost I assumed would be on a Starship, and then the
Ah,
highest launch cost I assume would be on New Glenn. I didn't even price like doing this on a Vulcan because that's going to be out of the ballpark.
and Falcon?
And I mean, Falcon would be still better than Vulcan. They have similar capacity. Vulcan's a little bit more, but yeah, Falcon is much cheaper than Vulcan. We think it's about half the price. But yeah, it's really either Starship. If not Starship, it's going to be New Glenn. And
And it'll
so,
be
yeah,
more expensive on New Glenn, essentially, is what you're saying.
it
Am I
will.
right?
It will. Cost per kilogram is going to be a little higher on New Glenn, but it's still doable. And so, yeah, it'll add for a constellation
And
of
it doesn't depend
interceptors.
upon a friendship falling apart or staying together, at least not right now.
Yeah. Well, but let's be honest that SpaceX, yes, it is centered around Elon Musk. He controls the company. Blue Origin is also not a publicly traded company. It is fully owned by Jeff Bezos. Now, I think Jeff Bezos's temperament is, the polar opposite of Musk, but still, you're dependent on one billionaire and whether or not he continues to be interested in this.
And Bezos has proven that he will bend the knee. I mean, after what happened with the Washington Post in the opinion section, right?
Yeah, so we'll see what happens, but again, it's also dependent on can they scale the operations of New Glenn? Can they get this so that they are launching literally, 100, 200 times per year? That's what they would need to get to support something like Golden Dome in a very large, space-based interceptor constellation, and that's not going to happen anytime soon for New Glenn. So, but yeah, your costs would go up. I mean, I think for a constellation of like, roughly a little less than 2,000 interceptors, which would be enough to intercept 2 incoming missiles at a time. That's right. It's about 1,000-to-1 ratio for
Wow.
boost phase intercept. It's not good. Yeah, then I think your cost would go up. I think it's around like 5 to 7 billion for that, for just the initial deployment cost, if you're going to go with New Glenn instead of Starship. So yeah, it's substantial, but it is still doable. It can still happen.
All right. So we're running out of time, but I've got one last question for you. So while we have these protests in US cities, trade and tariff negotiations going on, and we all know that the big, beautiful bill, that's a weird mega budget bill, it is winding its way through Congress. What can legislators do, if anything, to reduce our national security exposure to the possible loss of SpaceX services? Or should they do anything? What do you think there, Todd?
So I would say number one, it has already been policy that we do not want to be singularly dependent on any one launch vehicle or any one company for
And yet
space
we
launch.
are.
And we are, but DoD, the Space Force, has already done what it can do to make sure we're not dependent. They've done the best they can by keeping, ULA part of the NSSL contract and bringing on new companies like Blue Origin and others into the mix. So they're doing what they can to support diversification within the space launch market. I don't think there's much more Congress can do other than just continue to fund it, continue to keep the funding flowing, because when you cut funding for things like the Space Force and for space launch, that drives decisions to try to get more efficient. And more efficient means less diversity in the launch market. So keep the funding going. We don't need a change in policy because we already have the right policy. So yeah, I would say that's the big thing. The other thing is, if you want to help these companies, don't start the year on a continuing resolution. Although I'm saying that into the void of space where no one is going to hear or do anything about it. But I mean, that is a problem that affects all of these companies in different ways. And the smaller the company, the more they're hurt by starting the year on a CR and having delayed contract awards and things like that. Keep the funding going, keep it predictable and steady. But the other big thing is this one big, beautiful bill. This is a one-time, one-off supplemental. There is no guarantee, and I would say the odds are likely that there's not another reconciliation bill like this anytime in the foreseeable future. So that's great if it passes. There'll be $150 billion extra for defense, but that is just a one-time infusion. If you want to put all of these programs and put all our entire space enterprise on a more stable footing, it's got to be in the base budget. You've got to have the base budget that is sufficient to support all these programs, all these activities, and multiple providers. And so if you want to make sure we're not critically dependent on any one company, that's what Congress has got to do. It is stable, predictable funding in the base budget with a plan for how we're going to continue that funding in the future. The reconciliation bill does not provide that.
Todd, thank you so much for coming on the Downlink podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great discussion.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.